that I had missed.
Great.
And
Thank you for reminding me. I just turned on the recording for today. I know there's a little confusion about today's class. That initially I thought we would not be meeting today. You may have seen that, so I had to rescind that. I have a general theory that if I can't teach both classes, I will cancel both of them. I thought I would not be able to teach the evening class, so that's why I initially thought I'd cancel today. I'm going to a concert, and therefore but when I canceled the evening class, I said, oh, yeah, I can teach and go to the concert. So I don't know. It may be a smaller group. I don't know if word. Did you see the initial word about? But you did get word that today was being. Did you get an email that today was class was meeting?
no, but I didn't see a message that there would be today's meeting. Usually I get a message like the day before that there would be.
Well, the office was closed yesterday.
Right.
Yes, it used to be a. What do we call it? It was the great holiday of the second Monday in October.
Indigenous Peoples Day.
Indigenous Peoples Day. Wonderful.
Morning.
Okay.
Morning, Harriet.
Good morning, Harriet.
Good morning, Harriet.
Yeah, it's easy to miss that one. As we all know, it used to have a different name.
A plug of Columbus.
Yeah. As I like to say, some of you have heard me say this. I used to be born on Columbus Day. Oh, well. At least I got off from school when I was a kid. Some of you who went to public schools in New York City may remember that they were closed on October 12th in the past.
Went to the post office. I forgot it was Columbus Day.
I went to get my mail from the mailbox, and I said, oh, wait a second. No wonder there's no mail. I get it. Such is life. But like I said, I hope that initial message that we were not meeting today may have gone, and it says it was the office was closed. That's right. So they didn't send out a special message about today's class. I don't know if that might mean we will have a particularly small class today. I didn't think about the fact that yesterday was a holiday and they wouldn't be able to get out the notice.
But it was in the Insider.
In the Insider, I did say that we were meeting today, right? But there was a notice in the News and Views that we were not meeting today. So there is some confusion. And then to add to it, as I said, there was the office closed yesterday, so they didn't send out the reminder. Okay. Well, here's our choices. I'm happy to go ahead and teach, even for the three. You guys are here, so we can just go ahead and we'll do a little more reviewing maybe next week when perhaps there are other people here. Yeah, there may be some confusion. All right, so why don't we begin? Okay, we're talking about conscientious objection in warfare. There are several interrelated issues. As we noted, Judaism is not a religion that requires pacifism. It's not a pacifistic religion. It's not like the Quakers or some of the Brethren, some of the other Christian churches that are pacifist. But we also know that there are sources, which we'll take a look at, that categorize wars in different ways. Generally 3 categories, which we'll look at. And then there's the question of individual conscience. And we have seen many examples so far of individual conscience where individuals have objected to what the laws were. And even if those laws were not only from non-Jews like Pharaoh, but also in cases of laws from Jews. So we have had some indication that private conscience has standing against a government. Now, the questions that we're going to be looking at, which are a little more complicated, and you'll see different answers, when there is a war, and it's a war that has been declared and we'll see different ways. In Judaism, does the individual conscience have standing to object to the war? And what sort of exemptions are there for individuals not to go to war? So these are kind of intertwined, and I think I mentioned last time that the articles we're going to look at, they intertwine these issues. So it's the source, I didn't tease out the sources as finely as I might have, because they tend to be discussed together. So there will be some overlap. Okay. Are we clear about that? Yes. Good. All right. So let us then very quickly, again, I just like to review, and we'll see this again. Everyone sees the share? Okay.
Yes.
We did look at this article by Ruvain Kimmelman, who gave us some of the examples about biblical exemptions for discretionary wars. Now, when we categorize wars, there are milchemet mitzvah, milchemet reshut, milchemet chovah, discretionary wars versus obligatory wars. Generally, obligatory wars are the wars commanded in the Bible to conquer the land of Israel, or defensive wars when one is attacked first. In general, it gets a little more complicated, but we'll see that. Okay, so there are certain exemptions. All right, and we looked at the exemptions. The person has taken a bride, and there are exemptions. And the one that we're going to take a look at more carefully is this question of where the Torah says those who are afraid and tender-hearted. And what that means precisely, we will see some disagreement. So let's take a look at one of the sources, which we were looking at last time, that tries to say something about it. Oops, I'm sorry. I think I just accidentally put the same one. Let's stop that. There we go. Let's go to the source I did want. There it is. Okay. And we had started looking at this, and we noted that these exemptions for, again, discretionary wars, you had let's go down. Someone has built a new house and not dedicated it. Someone who has planted a vineyard but not harvested it. Paid the bride price for a wife but not taken her into his household. And we had this question of interrupted activities. Okay. But then there was another interesting question, right? This question of fearful and faint-hearted. And the question was that anyone who is fearful and faint-hearted, those were people who have committed sins and are afraid that because they have committed a sin, they will die in the war, not because the enemy is stronger or better than we are, but because of their sins. So they're afraid of dying because God will punish them. That's one possible interpretation of this exemption for those who are fearful and faint-hearted. Notice in this case where we have this Mishnah, the fearful and faint-hearted are put together. Interesting question. Is it fearful and faint-hearted, meaning that's a description of one person, or does fearful refer to one type of person and faint-hearted refer to a different type of person? Classic rabbinic interpretation of the Bible, very careful reading of the text. And we will see there are individuals who are interpreting these texts who could read it either way. Okay. And the last part that we got to last week was this question of, and it's really, as I said last week, it's fascinating when a person spoke between donning the tefillin of the arm and the tefillin of the head, he has a sin, and due to the sin, he returns from the ranks. Even a minor sin, you might feel God's going to punish me for, and therefore you are fearful and faint-hearted. Again, that is saying that those two categories are the one type of person, and that type of person is a person who has committed a sin, is worrying about dying in war. Okay, fine. So we have some others. Well, let's go. Okay, this is again a Talmudic source, which is where we ended last time. When the verse singles out the fearful and faint-hearted, this is referring to one who is afraid because he has sins. According to this interpretation, one who stole another's real estate should return home because of his guilt. Okay, let's go to that. All right. Now, Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi, excuse
Yes.
me, I had trouble connecting. Is that why there's so few of us? I don't know if
No,
anyone
I
else.
think there's so few of us because it's my fault. At one point there was in the news and views that we were not having class today.
I had trouble with the sound.
Oh, trouble. The connection I can't.
Okay. All right. So you think
beyond my capacity to understand. But yes, there was confusion because at one point I did say we were not having class today, but that was overridden, and some people may not have seen the override.
Right, pity. Okay, got it.
And because yesterday was a holiday, the reminder didn't go out, just to make it even more confusing. You know, isn't it true sometimes that everything conspires to get something done wrong?
Well, the constant contact goes out is scheduled prior, because I know I've done that for my show and for other programs. So, but yeah, so I don't know.
I'm not sure why it didn't go out yesterday. I
know.
can't answer that question.
All
Okay.
right.
Sorry,
I'm here.
Sina, but hey, we're here. Let's learn. Okay. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says, no, sorry, Rabbi Akiva. It's to be understood that a man is unable to stand in the battle ranks and to see a drawn sword because it will terrify him. We're not saying that this is the person who's afraid of his sins and is going to die because he committed sin. Now we're giving it a totally different interpretation. What's the problem? Some people, now, is this a coward or is this a person of such sensitive conscience that we're going to say he because they didn't have she's at that time in the army, that his conscience prohibits him from participating in warfare. Now, in this interpretation, we seem to be talking more cowardice than principled opposition to war. Okay? So far. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says, that is fearful and faint-hearted. This is the one who is afraid because of his sins. And he too returns. Therefore, the Torah provided him with all these additional reasons for exemption from the army, so he can ascribe his leaving to one of them. In this way, the sinner may leave the ranks without having to publicly acknowledge that he is a sinner. In other words, when the Kohen Gadol says, anybody built a house and didn't dedicate it, anybody planted a vineyard, didn't harvest it, anybody was engaged but didn't get married yet, go home. So, Rabbi, now we have a difference of opinion here. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says we have all of those larger exemptions so that the sinners can also go home, and nobody's going to say, oh, he must have been, he's going home not because he's a sinner, he's going home because he built a house and didn't dedicate it, okay? So we again have this difference of opinion because the Torah is not, as often happens, the Torah is not 100% clear as to what we're talking about. So we have this difference of opinion, as you can see, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. In other words, Yossi HaGalili is actually saying fearful and faint-hearted has nothing to do with the individual's feelings about warfare, courage, or cowardice, or principles about warfare. It all has to do with the fact that he is committed to sin and he's afraid he's going to die. So this, by the way, is an important distinction, because if you argue that way, then in no way, shape, or form are we talking about any sort of conscientious objection, right? This is not conscientious objection because you don't like war. It's objection because you don't want to die because you're a sinner. Okay. Now we're continuing. The Gemara asks, who was the Tana, the teacher, the Mishnaic teacher, who taught this law that the sages taught in Eberita? If one heard the sounds of trumpets and trembled, or he heard the knocking of shields and trembled, or he heard the sharpening of swords and urine was trickling down his knees in fear. Oops. Now we're talking a different interpretation. we are literally talking about a person who doesn't have the courage, right? He returns from the battlefront. In accordance with whose opinion it is this? Shall we say it is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? Right? Remember, Rabbi Akiva said, unable to stand in the battle ranks. Is it Rabbi Akiva and not the opinion of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili? Yossi HaGalili said, no, we're not talking about people who have problems with warfare. We're talking about people who are sinners, okay? The Gemara answers, in this case, even Rabbi Yossi HaGalili would concede that he should return because it is written, what man is there that is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return, lest his brother's heart melt as his heart. Someone so clearly frightened invariably spreads fear to those around him. So they're arguing that in classic rabbinic pattern, oh no, those rabbis don't disagree. They're all on the same page. Why? Because the verse says, what's the issue? The issue is that we don't want someone at the front in the battle. And it says in the Torah, these people go back. Why? Lest his brethren's heart melt as his heart. You're going into battle and a couple of guys run away or go back, right? So we're saying, so this is an attempt to see to it that Rabbi Yossi HaGalili and Rabbi Akiva are saying the same thing, which is that the real issue here, the larger issue here is we do have these exemptions, and they include a lot of different things. And the issue is we're afraid about certain types of people who are going to ruin the morale of the army, and they all fit into this ruin the morale of the army, and therefore they don't. There's no disagreement. Okay, that's just but that brings in another interesting issue as well. Is the exemption there primarily for, again, we could argue we have now a new interpretation that actually you could argue is a third one. The third one is we don't want anybody in the front ranks who's gonna damage morale. And then we have this other interpretation. This is from a later source, Shnei Luchot Habrit. Okay, a sinner has to return home instead of fighting in the war called Milchemet Reshut. I mean, this is a discretionary war. In other words, they're saying that in obligatory war, the war is to conquer the land of Canaan, a defensive war, nobody goes home. In other words, you have stricter rules about exemptions in different types of wars, which, by the way, just as an aside, the United States military has had different types of exemptions and rules in different types of wars as well, but that we'll get to a little bit later, okay? A sinner is a person who has not completed his preparations for entry into any of the phases of the world to come. The Torah merely alludes to this by giving examples of people who have undertaken 3 different types of crucial enterprises without having completed their tasks, right? The guy who was married, the guy who planted the vineyard, and the guy who built a house. When the Torah stresses that any of these 3 categories of people is to shuv leveito, return home, this is not so subtle a hint to the sinner to engage in repentance. The whole point of this is to make the sinner repent and not fear that he has sinned and is going to die on the front lines. So now he's just sort of giving a, the word shuv, yashuv leveito, right, return to his home. Well, the word repentance is in the same root as the Hebrew word return. So according to this interpretation, the underlying issue is this question of the sinners, and when they say shuv leveito, return to your house, what is really being said is do repentance and you won't die in the war. So you don't have to go back home. So we've got sort of a variety of interpretations trying to figure out why is it possible that we have these exemptions. So okay, any comments or questions so far? Okay, is the issue the morale of the army? Is the issue of someone's afraid to die because of their sins? Someone is a coward, or someone has a principled objection to war? We've seen little variations on all of those. Okay, let's see what's next. All right. Just so we're clear on, and by the way, some of the interpretations we just had would imply that there is a concern on the part of the rabbis, not only for the sinner and for the incomplete nature of an action, but there does seem to imply that an individual might have some reasons of conscience not to be in the war. Again, a little vague, and some rabbis seem to disagree, but we'll follow this up. I'm going to step off to the side for a second, and this is an article just to clarify that larger issues about conscientious objection. During the Vietnam War, the argument to become a conscientious objector in to the United States military, you could not be a selective conscientious objector, okay? You can argue that there are selective conscientious objector. I don't like this war. And there's the general conscientious objector. I don't like all wars. One of the questions that was raised at that time was, in the Jewish community, could you be a selective conscientious objector? Is that really allowable in Judaism? Or does Judaism even allow for someone to be a total conscientious objector or even a selective conscientious objector? All right. So they're trying to argue in this article, which came out, after the Vietnam War. This is a series of articles, as you can see from the title, after the war. Is it possible even to be a selective conscientious objector? And remember, we've seen a long series of texts that do seem to indicate that the individual's conscience can object to the state's power. Shifra and Pua, the Pharaoh, there's the case in King Saul, there were multiple, King David, there were multiple cases. Okay. So this is an article that's written by Maurice Lamb, very well-known rabbi. I'm sorry, I may not have sent this one out. I'm a little behind on sending some of the articles out. I'll get them out. Maurice Lamb was the very prominent, if not the most prominent rabbi in modern Orthodoxy in America. Actually, he had a brother. It's very confusing. He had a brother named Norman. But Maurice was on the East Coast. Norman was on the West Coast. I was once in a restaurant, and they were sitting next to each other eating dinner, and it's like, oh, gee, they really look alike. But they were both of them were very prominent rabbis. Okay. So the question that Rabbi Maurice Lamb, also associated with Yeshiva University, I think he was the head. Yes, he was the head of Yeshiva University at one time. The issues of war and peace from a Jewish perspective, the question of pacifism and selective conscientious objector. In other words, can a person say that his conscience overrides the rules of the country that says that we're going to war and we can draft people into the army? Such a discourse now is reckoned with the recent 8-1 Supreme Court decision that selective conscientious objection can have no legal standing in American society. Okay. The problem, he says, there is the problem. It's funny in terms of the Middle East. We will, in a few weeks, talk about, there were some issues with reservists in Israel, but we'll get to that. Okay. We've debated long and hard the question of Jewish attitudes towards absolute pacifism, the moral rejection of the validity of any and all wars. The Jewish Peace Fellowship has made a convincing case for and has significantly inclined Jewish public opinion towards a more ready acceptance of pacifist doctrine, both in general and selectively. Okay. So some scholars have made attempts to prove essentially that Judaism espouses pacifism, except when God commands war. Well, that would be an interesting question, right? If the only time you can go to war is when God commands war, well, guess what? Too late. That doesn't happen anymore. But that case, as he will show, I'm sorry, but unfortunately, I scanned this a little irregularly, so the rest of the article is up here. Okay, this is still the Maurice Lamb article. Okay, well, Judaism rejected pacifism, and I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, we look at that; that's pretty obvious. We'll accept that. It opted on the national level for selective pacifism. That's an odd statement, is it not? What can that possibly mean? Judaism says you can't be a pacifist, but there's a national pacifism? What does that mean? And look at his analysis here. Just war criterion for judging the legitimacy of wars taken by the Jewish government. In pronouncing certain types of wars, it demonstrated selective conscientious objection. Oh, because we have principles that there are different types of war, certain types of war are objectionable. Not all wars, but certain types. And the wars that are acceptable have to fit into the categories. If they don't fit into the categories, then while we're not pacifist, we can't fight it. That's what he's trying to argue. Okay. Without filling in the entire spectrum of possibility, Judaism divides wars, right? Mandatory wars, milchama means war. Mitzvah, we know what mitzvah means. It's a commandment from God. Permitted wars, milchemet reshut. Well, reshut means permitted, right? Mandatory wars, other than Joshua's war and the battle with Amalek, right? You've got to fight with Joshua to conquer the land. And Amalek, Ad Hayom Hazeh, to this day, you got to get rid of Amalek, right? Those are mandatory wars. Refers only to strictly defined defensive wars fought under a moral imperative. It is defense of one's land, one's family. Such a war is, a moral reflex calling forth the unanimous and instinctive response. It requires no convening of judges, leaves no options to the people. There are no draft exemptions whatever, okay, including students, cowards, and the physically defective. In other words, what we have seen to this point are exemptions for milchemet reshut, for permitted wars. All the exemptions we have seen and all the debates about exactly what they mean only apply for milchemet reshut, not milchemet chova. Sometimes the words milchemet chova and milchemet mitzvah are used somewhat interchangeably. Okay. Permitted war today refers to one type, the preventative war, which reaches out to a known enemy who is judged to be preparing for a future attack and who has the men and weapons and motivation to invade. This war is initiated to enable the first strike in the enemy cities and amidst the civilian populations. Look, Maurice Lamb is writing this after 67 and the Yom Kippur War. So clearly we know he's talking about 67, which there was a preemptive strike. And someone would argue in Yom Kippur there should have been a preemptive strike, but we can argue about that. Okay. Such a war is permitted because it is not a clearly defined moral instinctive response and therefore requires, even according to Rabbi Judah, not only the declaration of the chief executive, i.e. the king, but the authorization of the Sanhedrin, this rabbinical group of 70 rabbis. The decision involves choosing among a hierarchy of values, the assessments of the possibility of defeat, a strategic evaluation of the military and political discernment. In other words, the assumption is that in Milchemet Reshut, the authorities in charge are making decisions as to whether or not this is a permitted war. People didn't invade you, so everybody agrees. We gotta respond. No, here's a case where you're going to voluntarily take up war, and the decision whether to launch that attack must be made by the governmental officials, whoever they are. He talks about chief executive and Sanhedrin. Okay. There undoubtedly was included a judgment of the moral criteria involved in the just war, determining the possibility of victory and the proportionality of the means, right? The just war rules do talk about those issues, as Jeremiah and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai have done in different circumstances. Even, I'm sorry, after the 71, the Sanhedrin was 71, most highly revered and wisest people of the country have pronounced on the morality of war. The king is still discouraged from unnecessary adventures by the exemption of thousands of the youngest and most capable people from the draft. Remember in that Reuven Kimmelman article, he points out, by allowing for these exemptions, you're also allowing for a large number of people who don't think this war is just a kind of backdoor way to get out of it. All right? Kimmelman was talking about that. Carol? Go ahead.
I'm wondering what Jewish law would have said in the case of the Vietnam War. My brother refused to serve. He left the country. The next thing I know, he was in the IDF. They never came back. They made Aliyah. So would Judaism have approved of his refusing to serve in Vietnam?
That is exactly what Lamb is talking about. Selective conscientious objection.
Yeah.
Let's see how let's see what conclusion he comes to. By the way, you're talking about two different things, but let's be clear. What does Judaism teach about it versus what is the law of the United States military, right? The law of the United States military and the vision of Judaism may or may not be the same in the terms of is selective conscientious objection allowable. Spoiler alert. In order to be a conscientious objector in the United States during the Vietnam War period, you had to be a total pacifist opposed to all wars. The laws of the United States, the military, did not allow for selective conscientious objection. If you wanted to become a conscientious,
lost his American citizenship.
Yeah, well, and then a lot of people moved to Canada. Or went to jail. I knew some people who went to jail. I'll tell you a story later on about Canada too. But the application for conscientious objector status during the Vietnam War period asked 4 questions, one of which was very specifically about opposition to all war. Okay, so in terms of at the time of the Vietnam War, the rules of the United States military did not allow for selective conscientious objection. It still doesn't. That's part of the rules. Now, Lamb is trying to understand, does Judaism allow for that? He's clearly pointed out, and we all know this, Judaism does not allow for total pacifism, but what about selective, right? So here he's going to make this his argument, okay? He points out, and we saw that in the Reuven Kimmelman article, that in the Milchemet Reshut, which is what we're talking about, the discretionary war, a war in which a government decides to have a preemptive strike against an enemy, you allow for the exemptions. And the exemptions are pretty broad, and they also are allowing for, Reuven Kimmelman makes this point, a lot of the people who fall into that category are the most military capable. How old are the people who got engaged and didn't get married? How old are the people who just built a house, right? So that is a serious issue where you might have large numbers of people who are opposed to a war finding a way out, right? Kimmelman makes that point. All right, but okay, right? The king is still discouraged from unnecessary venture by the exemption of thousands of the youngest and most capable men from the draft, right? So in other words, I'm going to have this draft and we're going to go to war, but my army isn't going to be so big because all these people aren't going to want to fight. So the king should be careful that he's declaring a war with the Sanhedrin that people are going to all be in favor of, right? Okay. The single crucial difference between the two categories is this requirement of authorization by the Sanhedrin, an aggregate of judges with the best brains and the most heightened moral awareness in the nation. Now, he's making the assumption, I can't help but say this, excuse me, that the highest court in the land is made up of the best brains and most heightened moral awareness. Let's make that assumption.
Anymore.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. But let's make that assumption that that's how things happened in ancient times. We don't know for sure, but okay, let's make that assumption. He's making that assumption, right? The Sanhedrin was a representative of the people, as the king was not, right? The king, it's hereditary, but you do have a representative of the people. All right, ignore that. Okay. Whether it was a clear mandate of the national consensus or the formal approval of the Sanhedrin, the community conscience, no war except one of defense could be declared by the chief executive. In other words, he's saying that the question of whether your conscience allows you to go to war is not determined by the individual, but is determined by the Sanhedrin and the king. In other words, there is a question of conscience in the declaration of war, but it is a national one because we assume that that question of conscience as to whether or not this is a justified war is going to be answered by the Sanhedrin, and it is not answered by the individual. Okay, that's Lamb's argument. Okay. Okay. This selective pacifism, i.e. pacifism that can only be determined by the Sanhedrin and the king, is a characteristic response of Jewish law to the harsh realities of the world. It is a pragmatic pacifism which determines each situation over the eternal values. It avoids the pitfalls of absolutism, i.e. we not pacifist totally, and perfection, and applies positively the Jewish quality of counterpower. Even more, opting for selective pacifism requires a more sophisticated level of moral discrimination as it seeks to balance values and choose among the competing claims of the soul, i.e., is it right for me to declare the war, which I know a lot of people are going to die, because there is such an imperative to do so. It requires a heightened awareness of the political as well as the military dilemmas in the context of moral values. Am I going to win this war? Is it going to be fought in a sense that it follows certain moral rules? I have to be concerned about these issues before I declare war, because A, I have a conscience, and B, I want everybody to fight it. But there is a sleeper in this affirmation of Jewish conscientious objections. It is true only on a national level, not on a personal one. Determination of the justice of a war was never left to individual decision. That burden devolved upon the state. Other than strictly for defense, war could not be embarked upon without the prior legitimization of the moral conscience of the community, the Sanhedrin. Now people are going to disagree with Lamb on this point, but at least we understand where Lamb is coming from. And of course, we understand the necessity of him talking about this after Vietnam, where the whole question of selective conscientious objection was very high priority. You know, I object to this war, but not all wars. And you would not, under the laws of the United States to this day, you could not become a conscientious objector. So that is that is the critical argument he's making. This question, and we'll see this again. To what degree does the individual conscious have standing to make that determination of what is right and wrong? We will note later on that we had, in this class, we had many examples where the tradition said, yes, those individuals made right decisions. Now, I don't think Rabbi Lamb would object to those, but he will say that once you have a national government and a national consensus, then that national consensus overrides, well, he is saying that, it overrides the individual conscience, okay? Okay, that's his argument, okay? Those who maintain that Judaism espoused personal selective conscientious objection as a legitimate draft deferment have based their argument on Rabbi Akiva, right? Yarei v'rach levav. So now he's going to, we've seen this critical verse where the Kohen, where the person making the announcements to the warfare says, okay, who is Yarei v'rach levav? You go home, right? Who are they? Now, we're going to see in other arguments, we've already seen that these are individuals who either are cowards, frankly, afraid that their sins are going to cause them to die, or maybe they have principled objections to war in some way. Well, we're going to see some other ones. Now Rabbi Lamb is going to have to argue against that, because those are the verses that were used during the Vietnam War that Judaism allows for personal conscientious objection. Now he's going to make an argument, which you will see. We'll look at his argument, but we'll also notice that there are other scholars who disagree with him. Okay, what is his argument? We just looked at it. Rabbi Akiva says, fearful and faint, hard to be understood. He is unable to stand in the battle ranks and see a drawn sword. Again, is that because if he doesn't have courage, or is it because he objects to the whole concept of warfare? Okay. Even as Rabbi Akiva tries to clarify what that means, even his clarification could be understood in different ways. So Rabbi Lam is going to say, okay, let's try to understand what it means. And this is his argument. Adds the Tosefta. Even the most powerful and the mightiest of the mighty, if he is a compassionate soul, it's an interesting question, a compassionate soul, must return from the ranks. With the best of intentions and with the greatest desire to transform the biblical phrase into relevant liberal modern terminology, here's he's going to argue against it, the Tosefta's compassionate soul who must return from the war is not a conscientious objector. Stop. That's his argument. By the way, that's going to be the line that others are going to disagree with, because we have this question, who is this compassionate person? Sounds like could be a pacifist, okay? First, the Tosefta's addition in itself must accord with the Akiva's principle that the phrase be taken literally, faint-hearted. Whatever that means, right? This compassionate soul has a psychological revulsion to bloody content, but hardly relates to the tough-minded conscious and the religious or humanistic based. Indeed, how one, in other words, it's an interesting argument here. You know, pacifists would always argue that people who believe in nonviolence are not softies, right? They're not just softies in every way. They're tough-minded people, right? So here, Lamb is saying, right, this compassionate soul hardly relates to the tough-minded. So he's saying, now, wait a second. If you say that a person who is a pacifist is not a weakling, which what pacifists always claim, then it can't work here. Why? Indeed, how would one interpret the biblical prescription immediately following that the anointed priest preaches to the soldiers, Al yarech levavchem, do not be faint-hearted. So his argument is taken. Let's go further down in the discussion of what happens before warfare occurs. And before the troops go into battle, they are told by their leader, don't be faint-hearted. Surely he did not warn, don't be compassionate. Well, we'll hear Lamb's argument, and we'll mention, okay. So he is saying that if the general says to the soldiers, don't be faint-hearted, how could that possibly be the same thing as the person who is exempted from service? This must be something else. For if we refer to a conscientious objector, why is he not included among those who never leave for war, instead of those who must go to war but entitled to return? This is a little weak argument here. One could argue, he is right that this question of who goes back and doesn't fight is left after basically they go through basic training and now they're on the battlefield. His argument, if this was a conscientious objector, they shouldn't have gone through basic training and be on the battlefield and wait until the battle begins, and they should have at some earlier point been told you shouldn't be here. That is arguing from something that the Torah doesn't have. You could argue that, but I'm not sure it's that strong. Obviously, his faint-heartedness is, now he's saying, an intuitive reaction, not a considered and deliberate moral judgment, based upon the concept that, and this is where you have to argue, if it was a deliberate moral judgment, it should not have been you should not have had to wait until you're actually on the battlefield to get the exemption. maybe. I don't find that really totally convincing, but I understand where he's going. Finally, the halakha placed no additional burden of proof on the compassion. On the contrary, it exempted this category from the requirement made of all others who claim exemption and return to the camps that they bring testimony. Okay. Elsa's Maimonides says hordes of soldiers would invent similar situations and deprive Israel of ever being able to wage war. Only the faint-hearted need bring no evidence. His evidence is with him at all times. Now that can go either way. His evidence is with him at all times. Oh yeah, that guy Joe, Joe's always a coward. Everybody knows that. He's been a coward his whole life. He doesn't do anything brave. As opposed to saying, well, wait a second. Maybe Joe was known as a really compassionate guy. There's a sense here. I see his argument, but I just don't find it totally convincing, right? Remember, he's saying that only the faint-hearted need bring no evidence. Most important, however, for the assertion that there is no personal CO is that it is highly unlikely, now this is again speculation, which we can agree or disagree, that the Sanhedrin had rendered a moral decision affirming the right to war. The individual could place himself above them in a position greater of insight or greater authority and declare that for himself this war was immoral. Okay, maybe, but maybe not. All right. After the war, Judaism has rejected Torah, believed in pragmatic pacifism. This is a selective pacifism. It's only a public national decision, not a personal one. The public was not permitted to embark upon a moral combat without the prior authorization of the Sanhedrin, functioning as the community conscience. That having once been declared, however, it was expected that all individuals would be subjected to the decision. In an American culture and a Protestant ethic which places a premium on the individual conscience, these words may register as anachronistic, but that is how I read my Judaism. Now he's adding an interesting other argument. Yes, the Protestant ethic does emphasize individuality versus group identity, right? We have the Jewish people, right? We have a sense of we're all connected, and that the individual subverts his individual desires sometimes for the sake of the whole. By the way, just as an aside, the whole question of can you be a good Jew and not be a Zionist? Does that mean that you as an individual have the right for your individual conscience to object to what is clearly an essential aspect of Jewish identity? There's a rabbi in Manhattan, Rabbi Amniel Hirsch of the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue, who gave recently some sermons on this. Go to the forwards, you'll hear about this. But here, this is kind of the final argument that Lamb is throwing in. Judaism does now. He's right that it's the modern world that attests about the importance of individual conscience in many ways, and that Judaism does assume a communal feeling, but I kind of think he's still sort of throwing in an extra argument at the end. Okay, comments or questions about Lamb's position? Okay, anyone? I think he makes the best case that could be made for this. As you can see, I don't think he's totally convincing, but he does make, I understand his making a case. There's a larger question as well, which we'll get to later, is that in the modern world, to what degree do we look for the jurisprudence, the way the government was run in ancient times, and apply that to the modern world? I mean, that's another larger question. He is making that assumption. Okay. Question or comment? Yes or no? Okay. We have a few minutes. We will then where are we going? Okay. So now let's take a look. We'll start to take a look. 1 second, let me just write some text out here. Okay. Oh, I see what I want to do. Okay. This is another article. Again, I don't think I sent it out. You'll have to wait. Did I send this one out? Oh, I
Yeah.
did send this one out. Yes, this I did send out. Okay. He's going to make the opposite argument. Okay. I got both the Gendler article and the Lamb article from a book on Jewish ethics that was published in the 1970s in this section, or in the Jewish tradition. I don't know if it mentions, no, it really doesn't. Everett Gendler was a major leader in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War period. He's a Reform rabbi. You saw his name in a lot of stuff. So just to make that clear, he is not an Orthodox rabbi. He's a Reform rabbi, but he's a very, very outspoken person in this period. Okay. He begins his argument by saying, we don't have in Jewish life all that much about just war and war and peace, right? The first, he points out about the issue of just war, doctrine, conscience, selective conscience, objective. There's an embarrassment of poverty. There is no great corpus of biblical and rabbinical legislation dealing with these issues. Note, Lamb has to talk about biblical times. Well, that's a long time ago. Haven't some things happened between biblical times and modern times? And the answer, of course, there has. But in Judaism, from the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the second century of the Common Era until 1948, there was no Jewish sovereignty. So these questions were theoretical, if they were asked at all. And in many cases, they weren't asked in any great depth or detail. Notice, Lamb and the other sources have to go back to Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Yossi HaGalilee from the Galilee. So the first question that Gendler is raising is, we don't have a long history of this thing. The Christians, of course, you got Augustine, Aquinas, Christian kings, right? Naturally, there was no felt urgency to formulate anything so directive of the use of power, just war. We have the Bible, okay? Nevertheless, there are some elements that he's going to look at in biblical and rabbinic tradition, okay? So what do I do here? Okay. So again, here these are the texts, and we had these texts. We've looked at these texts before. 3 exemptions: marriage, house, vineyard, and the fear and the afraid and faint-hearted. Yeah, we've had those. Okay. With respect to the personal exemptions, he's using another Jonas Peterson, a biblical scholar, yes, a Christian one, suggests that the following profound human consideration is at work. The army should not only admit its ranks men who are entirely merged in the whole and act on part of it. In the military laws of Deuteronomy, we find that passage. We just don't go over that again. A close inspection will show that the laws are not considering casual instances, but something greater and more profound. In all 3 cases, the man has started something new, important undertaking without having finished it. In such a case, something has been created, which is greater than the man himself. A new totality has come into existence. That's, again, the marriage, the house, and the vineyard. To make a breach in this prematurely, that is to say, before it has attained maturity or has been finished, one might be also say has been consecrated. I think consecrated is a good term as well, involves a serious risk of sin. This risk must be avoided for the sake of the cause itself, and the man who came to the army after committing such a breach might mean a danger much more than a help in the psychic whole constituted by the army. So when he is saying that the person who hasn't completed all this stuff, his focus might not be there. Now, whether it is because he's thinking he's a sinner and he might get killed, or he's thinking, I was in the middle of something. I'm having trouble focusing on the war because I left off all the stuff that I really needed to do. Okay. Just looking at the time. Okay, we'll just take a quick look at this. We do not find a full just war doctrine. Yes, we've seen that. He's going to talk about, again, Milchemet Chovah, Milchemet Mitzvah, the mandatory and obligatory wars. And he does talk about, the mandatory wars being Joshua's conquest, campaign against Amalek, and the clear and immediate defense against an attack. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of difference about if you have a clear and immediate defense against an attack. Now he says already launched, right? We said a Milchemet Reshut, a discretionary war, is before the attack has been launched. A Milchemet Chovah or Mitzvah would be after it's been attacked. But if the attack is about to occur, that's a Milchemet Reshut. But he also points out that there are other categories: expanding the boundaries, or to strengthen one's strategic position, increasing the power of prestige. Okay. Then we're calling those Milchemet Reshut. Okay. In evaluating these classifications, it is well to keep in mind that they are largely theoretical findings, right? Again, we're dealing there was no practical examples from the 2nd century to the 20th century, okay? There is also evident among Jewish authorities a strong tendency to emphasize limitations in these discretionary wars, right? That kind of war, now here we're going back to what Lamb had said, could only be declared by the Sanhedrin of 71, all right? Okay. Okay. In the 3 cases of Milchemet Mitzvah, the wars may be initiated by the king. So, again, we're talking about some things that we've seen in Lamb. In the cases of Milchemet Reshut, they had to have the court of the 71, which we talked about. Okay. Now he's going to talk about the exemptions. The 3, the person who's married, okay. The one who is married do not move from their place. They don't join the army. They're not there when the other exemptions are mentioned. He who built a home and dedicated, planted a vineyard, we got the 3, okay. These do not even supply water and food or repair the roads in the army, i.e. alternative surface, okay. This is Milchemet Reshut, the 3 biggies, okay. The exemption in such cases total. We note that the provision of Rach Levav, now here he's coming to our critical issue that we've talked about, tender of heart, in all opinions applies to all cases of discretionary war. He agrees with that. We've seen that before. On fact of some import, now here's where the important part is here. Since no war today can be regarded as either Chovah or Mitzvah. No king, no Sanhedrin. So if you want to go strictly by the biblical and the rabbinic determinations of wars, there are no required wars anymore. There are only Milchemet Reshut. Now, we can argue about this with the state of Israel, but at least let's see what he's saying, okay? Understand that, okay. All right. He is saying that any attempt to validate a centralized and bureaucratized system of mass conscription on the basis of early biblical practice and later prophetic evaluation is a serious misreading, right? So he's pointing out that we really can't apply these categories. So he's really arguing totally against Lamb, who is using those categories and that possibility as a way of applying it to this question of a national conscientious objection, right? So he's saying, Lamb, you're wrong. You're applying something that occurred in ancient times, and those categories were fine when you had a Sanhedrin and you had a king, but without a Sanhedrin and a king, we're in a different war. We're in a different war. Okay. Okay. There were 2 occasions on which exemptions were granted: before conscription and after entering the ranks. All right. It seems evident from the foregoing that Judaism cannot be characterized in the strict sense of the term as a pacifist tradition. Okay, we got that. It seems equally evident that Judaism does not regard every war as permissible. Okay, we get that too. nor does it regard every means of prosecuting war as permissible. It is further evident that while Judaism is highly respectful of duly constituted authority, this does not absolve the individual from the duty of making responsible moral decisions. And how does he know that? Neither these moral decisions nor their bases are delegated to human authority in any unchallengeable way. Now we can say that is true generalization based upon Shifra and Pua and all those other examples of individual conscience that we saw. That is correct. Here is the critical nexus, shall we say. It's which we'll see Gendler and Lamb are going to disagree. Those individual choices where the human being makes moral decisions and chooses not to follow what the national consensus is, are they allowable in Judaism? Obviously, Lamb has said no. On the other hand, Gendler is saying yes. If the above be an accurate reading of an essential part of the Jewish tradition, that's where people are going to disagree. Is this a total allowability of the status of the individual conscience? He's saying it is. All right. If that is an accurate reading, okay, let's allow that to be. It would appear that selective conscientious objection on the moral grounds is a fundamental teaching of Judaism and a fundamental demand of its adherents. That's a pretty strong statement. So here we have that question. And again, we see the different opinions on this. Does the individual moral position have standing in the questions of warfare? Lamb clearly has said no. It's a national question. Gendler is saying, well, we have examples of individuals having moral choices, and he is extending that to warfare, and he's denying what Lamb has to say in that the rules about how the wars are determined is a national consensus of conscience, because those questions of the Sanhedrin and the king, well, they just don't exist anymore. So you really can't apply it. So there's where we see the difference of opinion on this. Okay, comments or questions? So on that question so far, and we'll leave it at this, as to whether or not selective conscientious objection is allowable in Judaism. We're not talking about the United States Army or the government of the United States, but in Judaism, we clearly have a difference of opinion. And I would argue that I could see the arguments of both sides, but it's a little more, there's a lot of judgment here when you decide where to place the basis of selective conscientious objection, and you can read the sources in different ways. Okay, any questions or comments before we conclude? We're going to take a look at some examples in we can take a look at a very famous example, which I didn't even know existed during the United States war in Vietnam, and how that turned out next time we meet. Okay, any other comments, questions?
Good job.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Good day. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
The etrogs and lulavs won't be available till tomorrow. I just got an email from Thorin. So if you were planning to pick yours up, wait till tomorrow. Enjoy services. Have a nice holiday, and we'll meet next week.
Excellent day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.